Greetings, 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 greetings. I hope you're having a wonderful Shabbat. I am. See who's on here today. Okay. Good people. Good people. Now, I need your help. We're going to do Paul today simply because Rich had to be gone. He'll have to be gone a couple more Shabbat. He'll be out of town. So you're stuck with me. One thing that was suggested is that we refurbish Paul again, see where our attitudes are concerning him. And, we've done a lot of work on Paul, trying to find the secular life that is so missing. We only know him from his letters, what he has written about himself, and other people have written about him as well. And some of what they have written contradicts some of what Paul has written. So again, let's look at that. I like to gauge the opinion that we have on the Apostle Paul or the Apostate Paul, wherever you happen to stand on him, and go forth from there. Would anybody like to start out?
Well, you can't understand the Apostle Paul unless you have a deep understanding of Judaism.
That's true. And also Greekism. He's kind of floating in between there someplace. I was looking at a book today by Ellen Pagels. I was looking at the title of it anyway, and it was called something like Paul the Gnostic, Gnosticism in the writings of Paul. But as far as us readers know, if we know something about Gnosticism, it appears that he's speaking against Gnostics. For Gnostics, as you know, like Simon Magus, believed in two gods, a high and lofty, ineffable one that nobody could see, nobody could really participate in except himself, and a lesser creator god, Yaldabaoth, that was evil and created the earth and all that is on the earth, and that all that is on the earth is evil. So the philosophy there was, if everything on earth is evil and you can't get away from evil, let's go ahead and be evil. That's no problem, because the flesh is nothing. It's the spirit that is everything. So no matter what you can do with the flesh, makes no difference in the economy of forever. The other side of it was that because the flesh is evil, we are trying to reform the flesh and bring it into line with the spirit. That's a second type of Gnosticism. And they say that the most Gnostic passages in Paul are in Colossians, chapter 2 especially, but a little bit in Ephesians and so forth. So maybe he was confirmed a little bit in that way, or maybe there is a second Paul who is writing some of these later letters, and that's what scholars believe. As far as his own religion, as we know, he claimed to be the Hebrew of Hebrews, and that he was brought up among the Pharisees. And we know from other sources that he also worked for the Sadducees in Jerusalem. And so certainly he was fully aware of what Judaism was, at least from his standpoint as a Grecian. Anything else? A few things we know from outside the scriptures is the possibility, or probably the fact, that Paul went to Spain and Britain and traveled throughout Europe on his way back to Rome. And he was in the company of a cohort of soldiers. We read that in the Sonini manuscript. And again, in the Clementines, we read about Paul, supposedly Paul, having assaulted James on the steps and leaving him for dead. and then going off to try to find James and the group who had left Jerusalem out of fear of him. Then we have the Acts of the Apostles, where we have Paul on that same road, and he encounters a vision. And this is important. I believe that's Acts chapter 9, where there's a great light and a voice. Paul, why do you kick against the pricks? This is a great revelation of Yahshua HaMashiach to Paul on that road as he was going forth in a murderous rage to conquer the believers in Damascus. But he never speaks of this in his letters, at least not that I know of. Do you know different? And so if we're of a more skeptical mind, we might consider, is this a gloss of the writer? Or did Paul actually have this experience, go to Damascus, become healed by one Ananias, and then go into Arabia for a couple of years? Then the question is, why did he go to Arabia? I have theories on this. What was there for him? Because now we look back into Romans and we find that Paul is a confessed Herodian. He's a member of the family of the Herods. We go back on his genealogy and we find that to be true. In fact, he was, according to the genealogies we read, he was a grandson of King Herod's sister, Salome. And his father was one of the minor Herodians. What was his name? Antipatris? Not sure, can't remember now. But Paul talks, or Acts talks about Paul having a nephew. And that nephew was Julius, let me see. Julius Alexander, right? And that nephew was the one that tipped off the Romans to the fact that Paul was in the middle of an attempt on his life in the Jerusalem temple and thereabouts when he made a visit there. That nephew we have been able to find in history as well. He's spoken of by Josephus as having, when he became an adult, purchased the first copy of Josephus, The Jewish War, in the 70s. Wow. So many little pieces to put together. And so a lot of people today are very doubting of Paul. And they make it known in their podcasts and on YouTube and their teachings, of course, that Paul is a devil, Paul apostated the entire movement, or the people of the movement begin to follow this Pied Piper off into Torahlessness, etc. We know from other letters that Paul and Seneca were correspondents. Yeah, there are some letters of Paul that are not in the Bible, but they appear to me to be authentic. No reason not to think so. Seneca, this friend of Paul, was the richest man in the Roman Empire. He made a fortune in Britain during the conquest of Britain by Claudius, in buying up land that was scarfed up from the Britons and then renting it out to the Britons that had owned it. Seneca was also he was the guardian of Nero, the emperor, because Seneca found himself, if you're interested in this, Seneca found himself sent away by Claudius to an island by himself because of his exploitation of Britain. But when Claudius was assassinated by his wife, who was Nero's mother, by being fed a poisoned mushroom, then Seneca was brought back by the mother on one condition: that you be the guardian over my son, who is a successor to Claudius. Oh, of course, there had to be more people killed before Nero could be the successor, including Claudius's real son. And his mother saw to that. His mother was Caligula's sister. Now, why am I going into this so much? Well, we have Seneca, who is the the guardian of Paul, or I'm sorry, the guardian of Nero over a long period of time. And we have letters between Paul and Seneca, because Paul and Seneca were both known philosophers in the Roman world. Seneca probably better known than even Paul, especially at that time. Besides being the richest, he was also the most famous. He was of the Stoic philosophy. His writings today are still quite popular, especially his meditations on death. And it seems that Seneca and Paul swapped letters, and they communicated regarding these letters. And so one of the letters tells us that Seneca had shared Paul's letters with Nero and his wife Poppaea. And a legend comes later that Poppaea became a convert of the Nazarene faith. We hear that from actually several sources, at least that she was well disposed to it. But the letter from Seneca to Paul, after he says that he read the Romans and Corinthians and so forth to Nero and Poppaea, he says that they were not really well disposed to it. But I will make them understand it better and perhaps come into your philosophy. Well, it got worse and worse, and finally, Nero, of course, blamed the Christians for the burning of Rome, and you wonder where he got the idea that this little group in Rome called Christians would burn down the whole town. Well, he might have got it from Seneca, having read Paul's letters. And Paul, in his letter to the Romans, as you know, names all kinds of Romans at the end, and Corinthians, names all kinds of Corinthians at the end, that Nero might prey upon if he were disposed to do that. Well, Nero orders Seneca to go kill himself, and he does. By this time, he's quite aged. And then begins what historians call the Great Tribulation of the time, whereas Nero called forth for the persecution of all Christians in the entire Roman world, gathered them up, put them in the arenas, lit them up to light his courtyard at night so the people of Rome could enjoy a good fire at night. Did all kinds of horrid things to believers. I don't think we can think of these Christians as we might think of a Christian today. Quite different, really. This was long before Constantine and all that mess. So there's also some rumors about Paul and Poppaea. Believe it or not, that is the Nero's wife. By the way, she was kicked to death by Nero, unfortunately. She could have been a really, really good influence on the entire empire. Josephus also talks about her being well disposed to Judaism that Paul preached. And so here we have a possibility that unwittingly, Paul or whoever wrote his letters, her secretaries for him, because some say that Paul really didn't greet the people at the end of his letters. That was the scribe that greeted them. He may have set up a blacklist for Nero and may have unfortunately become one of the cogs and wheels of the persecution that took so many people out in that time. So, this word is getting out pretty much, and more people are understanding it. And I think maybe I have to take some blame for that because I've really been on a quest to find the historic Paul. But in the Gospels themselves, Paul talks about the brothers of Messiah. He doesn't like them very much. Why can these bring women with them when Barnabas and I can't? For instance, we find that in his writings. Also, him calling them super apostles and pillars in a rather sarcastic way, I suppose. And we find the most interesting dialogue between Paul and James in Galatians chapter 2 and James chapter 2, which really culminates in Galatians 2:20 and James 2:20. This is an amazing coincidence, I guess, because both Galatians 2 and James 2 are, as I mentioned, a dialectic between the two on the matter of faith and works. And I don't know if you have a Bible alongside there, but I would just have you take a look at Galatians 2:20 as a matter of a statement of Paul, and then James 2:20 as a reply to Paul. I don't know if you've looked at that or not, or that dialogue that they have, but Paul says, I'm crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, not I, but Christ lives in me. Christ lives in me. We go to James 2:20, and James just simply says, in a literal translation, you empty man. If you look at those two chapters, you'll find that it's almost, um, as I said, a dialectic where we have Paul setting down in Galatians and then James answering almost topic by topic by topic, even using some of the same quotes. So we have people now that see Paul as somebody who took the flock off in another direction. And some even go as far to say as he abrogated the Torah entirely as he went into Europe. Either by intention or by the possibility that he was led to do that to some extent for the sake of the Gentiles, bringing them in. Romans is a very good example of a theology that gets away from good deeds and Torah onto a more spiritual gospel where outward things don't matter that much, but inward belief and faith does, which of course leads to Luther, who abrogated works entirely, and that anyone that would do works, even for the sake of the gospel, was leaning on their works rather than on faith in Christ, and therefore would lose the grace of Christ and be judged because of their works and judged poorly for them. Adding to this, we have Paul as Saulos written up in Josephus. And what it tells us there is that Paul was a Herodian, was one of the Herods, and that he had a gang in town in Jerusalem. He had a gang, and Josephus says he stirred up commotion wherever he went. But he always got away with it, he and a brother, because they were of the king's family. He's mentioned right after the actually after the martyrdom of James in 62 AD. Right after we get done reading about James's death, then we have Paul and his brother Bar Costabarus. It's another funny name game here. We've got Paul and Barnabas and Saul and Costabarus. Maybe they're the same people. But right after this death of James, we have Paul causing riots in Jerusalem, and he's called a bandit or a lestai. At that time, Josephus uses the word lestai as a person of the revolution. I'm thinking that Paul was probably too Herodian to be a part of the revolution. And then we have one book out here by a fellow we know on the internet, and it's a pretty good book that shows with a little bit of verbal juggling in the three letters of John that Paul was the Antichrist spoken of in Revelation. And that when the Revelator talks about those who say they are Jews but are not, they're talking about the assembly of Paul. I don't know about that. It's a very interesting read. I try to keep my mind open. As for me, I've read other stories of Paul, like the story of Paul and Thecla. That's supposed to be pretty authoritative. I like the story. It goes something like this. Paul is preaching in a house church, and there's a young daughter there, probably a teenager. Her name's Thecla. She's not allowed in the meeting, but she is in another room gazing through a window and hearing Paul preach. She is betrothed to an older man, a man of some means in the community, and her parents are very, very much looking forward to her marrying this man in order to get a little bit from the man. But Thecla is ambivalent about the whole thing. So she's listening to Paul, and Paul is preaching on chastity, which he does. Nazarene Acts talks a lot about chastity. Chastity is nearly next to godliness. But Paul becomes the object of Thecla's admiration. We can't go as far as to say she fell in love with him. But then she gets an opportunity to talk to Paul in person. Paul says, you stay with your desire. If you want to serve the master, then it's best that you stay single. It's best that you stay chaste. And the parents get mad at Paul for that, and Paul leaves. Well, what does Thecla do? She runs after Paul and starts following Paul. And Paul, of course, he's flustered at this because we've got this teenager coming after him. She wants to hear more. And then there's the story of the sanctified lion. You might remember that with Paul and Thecla, where a lion comes up to eat them both, and Paul starts preaching to the lion. And the lion becomes converted, and Paul baptizes the lion. And the way the story, well, one of the endings of the story is that Paul and Thecla are in the arena with the wild beasts, both being sent to their martyrdom. And a lion is sent out after them. And the lion comes out fiercely, but when he sees who they are, the lion cannot attack them because the lion is sanctified. I find that to be a very nice story, and probably some of it is quite true. Paul's also the one that taught the world how to say the name Jesus, not as Jesus, but if you look at the Greek in Paul's writings concerning how that name is pronounced, we can say in Greek that it was pronounced Yashus, not Jesus. Paul proves the pronunciation of the name if you can read those Greek letters. It's only later on that it becomes Jesus through several other influences. But if anyone knew the means of pronouncing the name of the Savior, it was Paul, who would know better. And he mentions that name in every one of his letters. Paul had friends in high places. He had senators for friends, druids for friends, 2 Timothy 4. Druids that had been captured in Britain, brought over to Rome, set up in apartments, including a king. And Linus and Gladys that we read about in 2 Timothy were a prince and a princess of the Druids. Linus being the one who is hailed as the second pope in Catholic lore. He had a long reach. There are other stories about Paul in Britain besides the Sonini manuscript where Paul is, well, there's a place, the Mount of St. Paul in London. There's a cathedral to him there too. But in the earlier days, this is the place where Paul hung out with some of the Romans and Druids that were there together, inhabiting Britain at the time. There are much stories about him, and people like Senator Rufinus or Rufus, who is Rufus was a Roman army infantry man, an officer that was in Britain during the time of the Claudian conquest of Britain, who came to know Paul and came to be converted under Paul and is mentioned in Paul's letters, one whom he met in Britain that came back to become a senator. Same way with the Druids. Paul meets them in Britain. When they're conquered and Claudius brings them back, Paul is there also. And the Druid high priesthood and kings were spared by a miracle from being executed by the Romans as a tribute to Claudius and his conquest of Britain as they were captured and brought back. Paul may have had something to do with that as well, because just the day before they're going to escort these Druids to hell, the Archdruid gets an audience before the Senate and appeals to the mercy of the emperor. And the emperor not only lets them all off, that is Claudius, but also puts them up in palaces to live, because their speech is so calls on the mercy and the quality of mercy that it's almost reminiscent when you read the speech of the letters of Paul. We know they knew each other. I think that's really cool. Now let me see, anything else here I'm missing? Oh, as you know, in the Nazarene Acts, we have Peter who confronts Simon Magus. All throughout, Magus keeps coming in and they keep having disputes and so forth. But there's another text that almost is a continuation of that text. And it has Peter and Paul together confronting Simon Magus before Nero. This is very possible. Simon Magus is known to have been thought of as a god in the flesh in Rome. He even had a monument up to himself in Rome as a god, calling Simon Magus the Elyon, just like it says in the Nazarene Acts. But this one is called the Acts of Peter and Paul before Nero, and it's very, it's very realistic. What happens is Nero calls them all in to see who has the power, because Nero wants the power, and he favors Simon Magus because Nero was cruel and horrible, and he was of the occult, and so was Simon Magus. And Magus is documented to have done some incredible deeds, including having the ability to fly. And so at Rome, in the court with Nero, Nero bids Simon to fly, and he begins to fly. Of course, his flight is made possible because he's held up by 4 demons, taking him through the air. This is just one of many of the great works that is attributed to Simon Magus in those early years. So we have a tag team here. Paul and Peter together. They're going to take on Simon Magus, and he's flying. And what happens is Paul and Peter, they take up different weapons of the warfare. Paul says, I will pray on my knees. Peter says, I will rebuke the devil. And so as Simon Magus is flying over, we have, in the early pictures of this, Paul on his knees praying to heaven, and Peter with his hand out, rebuking the demons. And as it turned out, this was the noted death of Simon Magus. The tag team took care of it because when the prayer was prayed, the anointing came, the devils were rebuked, down he came into the court before Nero, and he was killed that way. He was dead. Nero got mad. This story is a prelude kind of to the martyrdom of Paul and Peter. Nero got mad, and at this point wanted nothing to do with these good men and put them in jail and set them up to be executed during that time of persecution. However, let's go back to Acts 28, and we see a very rosy picture. No idea that Paul is going to be martyred by any means. We really don't have any evidence that he was, with the exception of one pseudo-historian of those early years that said that Paul was beheaded on the Appian Way, and there was at that time a memorial set up for him, but that's the only one mention we have of that. In Acts 28, it says there was no charge against him, and he went about freely in Rome. That when the Jews who were supposed to come and accuse him, they never showed up. It was like, what is this guy doing here then, with no accusers? But then Paul already had friends, Seneca for one, as I mentioned, and several others there already. And it's surely that Paul had his day before Caesar, and that Caesar would have undoubtedly been Nero. And almost Acts 28 is a setup for Paul's journey to Spain and Britain and then back. Because as I said before, he's set up with a cohort of Roman soldiers to take him from Roman base to Roman base over the Atlantic Ocean to Spain, then up to Britain, and then he comes back to Rome over land. And there's a number of places in that Acts 29 or Sonini manuscript that mentions places that he came and the acts that he did on the way through Europe. Also identifying Lake Pontius Pilate in Switzerland, where Pilate was thought to have ended his days as a suicide there and drowned in the lake. Paul preaches there and sees visions. I mean, there is a lot to this guy that we just never hear about. What we do hear is his epistles. And if you go to church, you're going to hear those epistles every single week. So, what do we do with Paul? One ancient writer tells us that the reason that Paul came from Tarsus was to marry the daughter of the high priest. Who is the high priest? Well, Caiaphas. And his daughter, well, he had a couple of them. One's name was Miriam, the other Salome. And that Paul exchanged his services for being able to marry one of those daughters, his services being to help get rid of the scourge of the Nazarenes. One author tells us that he suspects that Paul was the head of the temple guard, actually, working there for Caiaphas. That's A.N. Miller or A.N. Wilson. That's a really good book. Did Paul ever get the high priest's daughter, if this is true? It doesn't look like it. No, it doesn't look like it. Some have identified the high priest's daughter with the wife of Nero. Now that I haven't quite figured out yet. But one thing we do know is that Caiaphas' tomb was found not long ago. And in that tomb was an ossuary of the daughter or granddaughter of Pontius or of Caiaphas. So there's another historical person in there that we have just found. Okay, am I missing anything? Oh, yeah, just a couple others. The Dead Sea Scrolls and the Habakkuk Pesher. There is a personage there mentioned several times that bears a strong resemblance to Paul. This text, the Habakkuk Pesher, is dated to the mid first century AD. Also in here, there is a character that is so like James the Just and was written in the course of his life. And there's also one in the Habakkuk Pesher that bears so much resemblance to Yahshua and to other people, Caiaphas, and to the Roman legions that were in Jerusalem. It's amazing how it seems that the activity and events that are mentioned in this Pesher, which I won't go into now, match up with what we know about the history of that time from the biblical witness and other early witnesses. I've done some things on that. It's very interesting. And it would be, if anybody would believe it, it would be something that would verify the Dead Sea Scrolls in a very new and authentic way. So what happened to Paul? Was he actually beheaded? And what about his letters? Certainly, all the letters he wrote aren't in the Bible. There have to be more. Where are they? They have said that Paul had more influence on the world than anyone else that ever lived. I would have a tendency to agree with that. Wouldn't you? N.T. Wright lately has come out with um, a new study on Paul, which is worthwhile to go see. It's on the internet or it's on my site. N.T. Wright, of course, is the very well known British evangelical scholar, a man of faith who really is a scholar. And he purports that Paul did indeed, he was indeed the founder of the Christian church as it is today. And he makes points there that are nearly undeniable as far as him actually being the founder. So we can give him credit for that. I don't take that away from him. But how about us as Torah people? Now I've gone on for 40 minutes with this talk, and I'm going to expect somebody to say something here and help me out for the rest of this time. Tell me what you think about Paul. Is he a dichotomy in your mind? Was he double minded? Did he desert the Torah for the Roman world? Was that a good thing? All right, please. Come on, come on. That's the best I could do on short notice. I want to hear from you. Hello?
Let me just throw this out there. Based on the historical accounts and the secular writings about Paul, what is it that we really think concerning Paul? Is Paul a false apostle, a misguided apostle? What is he? And how should we regard Paul?
That's the whole question. One time I referred to Paul the Apostate on Hebrew Nation Radio as a joke. They promptly got a hold of me and said, no more of that or you're off. Okay. That's the question. Where do we stand with him?
I have a comment about this too, because
Thank you.
he wrote a lot of things about the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, the gifts that are not found very much of anywhere else. I've not read the Nazarene Acts completely, but I don't remember too much about the gifts of the Spirit or anything of that sort. It didn't deny that the Spirit existed or that gifts existed, but it never said much about them. Am I correct?
It has Paul's practice of or Peter's practice of the gifts throughout, and his saying that how one might acquire these gifts. Yes, that's in there, but not laid out like Paul does. No place else. So that's really valid. We wonder what good is Paul, and so certainly that's one thing we can't do without, because what happens? We look at Paul and we look at how the gifts move today, and we see something identical.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
exactly. And also the structure, even though it is found in Acts, Paul does a more thorough job of laying out in his writings what the assembly is supposed to look like. And I think that a lot of proponents and there are a lot of proponents out there of doing away with Paul, calling him as far the Antichrist or a false apostle. And I think that, and this is just from my perspective, first of all, who calls apostles? The head of the Kehillah. Who is the head of the Kehillah? It's Yeshua. If Yeshua, who is the head of the Kehillah, and it's Yeshua who hands out assignments, really what business is it of ours to question the call of the Messiah with regards to Paul. I mean, he does a wonderful job of laying out how we to handle widows and orphans, laying out what the structure should be like, laying out what you're supposed to do when you go into a town, how you ordain elders and overseers in every town and things like that. Some of the qualifications of said responsibilities.
Yes,
And
very necessary.
it's very necessary. And I think that, and if you'll check into these people, and this just me theorizing, most of the people that want to do away with Paul, they don't necessarily want to do, they want to do away with Paul, but they also want to do away with the first century structure of the body. Think about
Absolutely.
that.
They did. Then they have.
Mhm.
Hebrew Roots movement has done away with the first century structure entirely,
Exactly.
which is wrong because it's a good structure. It's also represented in the Nazareth and in the church fathers and everywhere else.
Mhm.
And they disdain some of the churches because they have kept it. Now, look, Bishop Ragesh, going back to Galatians 2:20 and James 2:20,
Mhm.
what's happening here, at least it looks like from James' point of view, is that Paul is claiming that he is now Messiah because the Spirit of Christ is now in me. I don't live anymore, but Christ lives in me.
You know what? I
Well,
believe that.
all right, so James calls him an empty man.
And he
I think
probably, and you know what? And why can't both James and Paul be right?
that's a
Why
good
can't,
question.
because think about this. You have heard me teach that I believe that you and I and everybody on this call are literally the legal body of Messiah in the earth. Okay? Yeshua is here and he lives in you. He lives through you. He reaches out to the homeless through you, the widows and the orphans that you touch through you. You see
Well,
what I'm saying?
I have a little different opinion on that. Not too much different, but
Go ahead.
yeah, I tend to think that he can, but I don't think Messiah as whole lives in me. He has renewed a right spirit in me, I believe, because I'm born again. But if he lived in me wholly and bodily, as Paul seems to claim, I could do no wrong. I could not fall back. I would, or if the Holy Spirit lives in me, I could not possibly fall back. You see, I see that the Holy Spirit he's talking about is the human spirit, and James is looking at it from the point of view of, you mean to say my brother's living in your flesh? Hey, I know him. You never even knew him. You didn't walk with him. But he's living in your flesh, you Herodian? Can you see how Paul would come in as a proselyte one time, get the right hand of fellowship,
Right.
and go off and make these kind of claims? And can you see that there would be animosity between those two groups?
Yeah, absolutely. And also, you could see that James is human. You know, we often think that we who serve as overseers and Mavakrim, that we are perfect. And it might be a hint of a little slight issue with forgiveness there, because remember, Paul did oppress the General Assembly. He oppressed them relentlessly. Okay? Those things can't necessarily be forgotten. They may have been forgiven, but they may not have been forgotten. And it shows a very human side to the bishops, the 12 bishops in Jerusalem, versus Paul, who was a proselyte and came in and came up through the ranks. And then, and you know, he's like, "You mean my brother's living in you? Why can't it be right? I believe that Yeshua lives in me. Sure, this broken vessel, he is chosen to reside in me through the Holy Spirit and functions through me. When I put my hands on somebody to lay my hands on them, it's not me, because I'm a mess. It's the hands of the Messiah that rest on them. I'm just a vessel.
Not to get too far off course, but of course, this is pretty difficult theology, but I can't see it that way anymore. I mean, I believe that Messiah does the miracles, yes, but through broken vessels rather than those that are, Messiah. Can he be in everybody at the same time or what? But anyway, one other thing that might add something to this is that Jerome makes a claim that if you understand the politics of Israel at that time, and Jerome having lived in Israel and studied with the Nazarenes, he says that it is wrong to think that Paul is from Tarsus originally. He says that he was born in Galilee or perhaps Samaria. So Paul, being a relative of Herod, who was an Idumean, maybe there's a little bit of racism in here.
Mm-hmm.
Just
I wouldn't be
a guess.
surprised. I wouldn't be surprised.
It would
As
be
a matter
more.
of fact, go ahead, Carl.
It would be more classism, most likely, because the Samaritans were not seen as full Israel. If
Well,
he's
at
a Samaritan, and the
the
Galileans were
time,
seen as local,
Mhm.
yokels.
kind of.
Also, I've even heard of Paul, if I'm not mistaken, referred to as an Egyptian. So that might
Yeah.
tell you some things as well.
Well, one thing about this is that at that time, few people know this, but there was a terrible war going on between Galilee and Samaria. The two were at full war during this era when Paul was preaching and James and all those people. Josephus reports on it. It was a bloody, bloody war that the Herodian troops had to come in and finally get stopped because they were raiding each other, and then finally they just came together in full out warfare, guerrilla war on both sides. So that might have had something to do with it too. I mean, that that area was and is always warlike. I kind of heard a joke yesterday. Oh yeah, the guru was getting ready to say his piece at a meeting, and he had a Jewish guy come in and said to him, "Shalom." And the guru said, "Well, what? What does that mean?" "Shalom, that's the highest greeting." And he said, "Well, what does it mean?" The guru asked him. The Jew said, "Well, that means peace." Let's see if I get this right. Well, what the guru said, "Well, if I was living where you're from, that would be the highest greeting. But I'm not living there," which is a way of saying that that's all there has been there is war all the time, and still is. Why do you suppose that is? Well, we'll have to get into that in Zionism next time.
Exactly. But that's definitely, I think that um, we need to, with regards to Paul, realize what Paul brought us and realize that the judgment of Paul is really up to the head of the Kehillah, not we ourselves. It reminds me of the parable when the people came out in the morning, he gave them a certain amount. There were people that came out to work in the vineyard at noon, and they gave them a certain amount. And then the people that came out at the end of the day, they received the same amount that the people received in the morning and the noontime. And the people that worked in the morning and the noontime got angry with the vineyard owner, which is representation of Messiah. Well, how come he came in at the 11th hour when he got the same pay we got? And what did Yeshua say? Yeshua said, "Mind your business. It's my business. It's my money. It's my property. I do with this what I want to do with it." And so I think that we have to look at it in that context, because if we don't, we can get bogged down and really distracted by, oh, is he really an apostle? I've heard people on this very call refer to Paul as the Antichrist, refer to Paul as a false apostle. And I'm like, what business? Who are you? Who am I? to decide who goes out to the vineyard and who goes out to the harvest. But
All right.
go ahead.
Well, Marcio says it's not about judging Paul, but rather what we do with his teachings. That was the next thing I was going to bring up here. As
Go
we
ahead.
get ready to end up. Maybe you can put something in on this.
I got something. One more thing, Jack.
All right. Let me just mention that
Okay.
Romans is pretty clear on the abrogation of the Torah. It's pretty clear that that is not for Gentile believers. Not long ago, I read through Romans again. And why, if we're to follow him, why are we taking up these laws? That's
Which
all.
laws?
Rhetorical question. Go ahead,
Which
Governor.
laws?
Torah.
I think one of the things that some people, they will look at the quotes that Paul uses, and they'll say, well, that they're wrong. Well, of course, they're looking at the Masoretic text.
True.
I don't know how big of a deal that is, but he's using this. Most of the quotes that he uses are come from the Septuagint Old Testament, and that has to matter because people would say, well, that he's quoting it wrong. But how many people actually do consider? Now, not that it would fix everything, it doesn't. I'm pretty sure. But if you're not looking at the right Old Testament, then you're going to see, of course, almost everything that he quotes is wrong.
And even Keeper said, listen, Paul's works are some of the most misunderstood teachings, which unlearned men twist to their own destruction. So
there's a reason for that, and that is that Paul wrote in very high Greek. Who are these yokels down in Galilee could even read that? They couldn't read it.
But it also says that we ourselves today have to be careful, because if Kepha is telling people, and he's kind of defending Paul in this instance, I think, that these writings get twisted and turned by unlearned men to their utter destruction, are we headed in the same direction when we say, okay, we want to get rid of it? I've even heard people right here in this town say it would be better if Paul were not even in the book.
I think that Paul ought to be in appendix. It's a commentary. The reason I say that is because there are a lot of people that are lost because of what Paul writes. I admit that we've got to have him. We would not even know Yeshua here if we didn't have Paul. But at the same time, he should not be the founder of the Christian church. He should be a commentator on the Torah, which he really is. And as you said, Governor, he's raised up in Tarsus, which is a totally Greek city in Anatolia. And he read the Septuagint. He quotes the Septuagint. He would have had little knowledge of Aramaic, I'm sure. And if he wrote these letters in Aramaic, all these people in Europe that he wrote them to wouldn't understand a word of it. If you look in his letters themselves, they're addressed to all Romans. There's not a Jewish name in there. So how are they going to read Aramaic letters? This guy was a man of learning, no doubt about it. His Greek is excellent. And there's nothing of him that still exists in any other language but that language. So whoever wrote and that part about him being hard to understand, whether that was an addition like some say or not, it is true. And if you read him in the Greek, man, he writes like a scientist. If we were to retranslate that today in modern English, scientific English, we would get quite a different story. Somebody ought to do that. Man, he writes high. All right, that's a good question. We got time.
That is a good question.
Kenneth here says, how do we get around where he says Torah is done or not applicable? That's what I have to think about it. He didn't write Hebrews, but Hebrews tell us that it's obsolete completely.
I'm not so sure about that, though. I'm not sure that that's what Paul meant, because and the same thing with the Messiah and anybody else. Anybody that would have come in there and say Torah is completely done away with, the clean food laws, it's all Besuda. That's it.
I learned that word last week. It's
And
trash, right?
you're correct. Anybody that would have said that. So if we know that Paul was somebody that taught the first century assembly, there is no way that Paul would have taught anything that was anti-Torah. So there's either something that we are not understanding, or there is something there that was put there later on to push an anti-Torah agenda by our church fathers.
All right, you're making excuses.
Nope.
I read Paul in the Greek, and it's fantastic, but you are right about mistranslation. He's mistranslated all the time. And of course, when you take up these Strong's Concordance and want to look up words, well, you notice that Strong's does not define words. What Strong's does is it tells you what the translators say. And you can have one word and it'll have sometimes 100 different meanings, because these are the ways the translator have translated them in the King James Version or whatever. The translations are, of course, in accordance with the doctrine of the church, which is a sad thing. But would that we as believers could study these languages more thoroughly when we're young, instead of languages like French and Russian that we're never going to use.
Or Spanish.
Yeah, well, we might use that. But this
Hey,
was
Jack.
in the Roman church, you study Latin. Go ahead.
Do you have an example that would be like a verse or something like that that jumps out at you? That would be, when you properly translated it, it said something either dramatically different or different enough that it would make a difference to people reading it.
I do have one that was the cause of H.T. Anderson to be thrown out of the Church of Christ when he translated the Sinaiticus, and that is, it's 1 Corinthians chapter 15.
Mm-hmm.
It says there's a natural body and a spiritual body. The first comes the natural and the other comes the spiritual, right? Remember that passage?
Yes, I do.
Okay, I think it's at the beginning of chapter 15 when he's talking about resurrection. But actually what it says there's a physical body, a somatic body, and a psychical body. Psychical, which they translate to spiritual, but it's not the same at all. We don't know what a psychical body is, but if you look at the H.T. Anderson translation that I have, he translates it right. He would not conform to the church. They tried to get him to change it. He stubbornly said it doesn't mean that, and they excommunicated him for just that one. But all of Paul, it's hard to translate, it's hard to read, and it's something you've got to study. Why don't we do that in church? Because if we studied the ancient languages in church, we would expose the Bible. That's the only thing I can think. Anything else before we go? Yes, Septuagint is a great resource. It's the oldest Bible that we have. Let's see. Oh, Marcel says she wants to discuss this a little more at boot camp. Maybe we'll do that. By the way, y'all, we're going camping. Is it next week? Next Thursday?
Next Thursday, yeah.
For Pentecost, I don't think we're going to be able to broadcast the service there, but maybe we will be able to. We'll see. But also tomorrow night, if you want to join us for communion, it's at 9:30 at night. You bring your own elements. We'll bring the service. And I thank you all for coming. I think Rich will be back next week, but I think the week after he'll be gone. And I appreciate you sitting through my diatribe. See you tomorrow night, maybe.